Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's words to his students captured this spirit perfectly. He said, "You have to stand upon your own feet. Do not depend upon others. Be men of character, men of honor, and be self-reliant." Those words became more than advice. They became a mission statement for a nation still in the making. And as this movement spread, something remarkable began to happen. The young Muslims who studied at Aligarh began to see their community not as victims, but as a nation with a purpose. They read Iqbal's poetry, they studied the Quran with new eyes, and they spoke of unity and progress. They were the generation that would soon carry the message of freedom forward. The British may have ruled the land, but the Muslims were beginning to reclaim their minds. They were discovering that power does not begin with swords or thrones. It begins with awareness. It begins with the courage to ask who you are and the determination to become what you were meant to be. And that awakening, that surge of realization was unstoppable. It traveled from classroom to mosque, from printing press to parliament. It gave the Muslims a new vocabulary, words like identity, representation, and nationhood. It lit fires in the hearts of men and women who had once thought that their destiny was written by others. This was not yet the political movement of Pakistan. No, this was its foundation. The soil was being prepared. The minds were being shaped and the hearts were being stirred. The Muslims had found their first answer to centuries of silenced knowledge, unity, and self-belief. This was the awakening of consciousness. The moment when a lost nation began to remember itself again. Every awakening demands a question. And after years of silence, when the Muslims of India began to open their eyes, they asked the question that would define their destiny. Who are we? Are we merely a community among millions, or are we a nation, distinct, complete, and deserving of our own future? This question was not born in the halls of politics or in the chambers of power. It was born in the classrooms of Aligarh, in the poetry of Iqbal, in the prayers of mothers who dreamed their children would rise again. It was born from struggle, from the pain of being forgotten, from the weight of humiliation, and from the hope that faith and identity could still stand against oppression. The Muslims of the subcontinent were waking up to a new world, a world shaped by Western education, British law and Hindu majority politics. They could see clearly now that they were being treated not as equals, but as subjects in a system that had no place for their voice. The Congress, formed in 1885, claimed to represent all Indians, but its speeches, its policies, and its ambitions reflected mostly the will of the Hindu majority. Muslim issues, representation, education, culture were drowned under the chorus of a single word, Indian. But what did Indian mean for a Muslim whose life, traditions, and beliefs were shaped by Islam? Could a Muslim's identity be dissolved into a single national label that ignored his faith? Could a civilization with its own law, language, and moral code simply blend into another? These were not questions of politics. These were questions of existence. And this is where the true transformation began. The Muslims started to see that they were not just a religious group within India. They were a nation defined by their own worldview. Their unity came not from geography, not from race, but from faith. Islam was their foundation, their compass, their way of life. Where others saw the land as mother, they saw it as amana, a trust from God. Where others worshipped the soil, they worshipped the Creator who made it. Their festivals, their dress, their language, their art, everything reflected a distinct culture, one that could never be fully absorbed into another civilization. This understanding, this recognition began to spread. Writers, poets, and thinkers started articulating what many already felt in their hearts. The Muslims had their own law, the Sharia, their own code of ethics, their own sense of justice. They had a history that stretched from the sands of Arabia to the courts of Delhi. They had given India its architecture, its literature, its language, its music. And yet, in the British India of the late 19th century, they were being asked to forget all that and become something they were not. But identity cannot be erased by decree. It may sleep for a while, but it never dies. The realization of Muslim nationhood was not sudden. It was a gradual awakening of consciousness. Every reform movement, every new school, every speech at Aligarh was a small spark. And together, those sparks began to glow into a fire of recognition. Muslim intellectuals began to argue that their community was not a mere minority. It was a Qaum, a nation with its own destiny. They began to speak of Millati Islamia, the global brotherhood of Muslims, as the source of strength that transcended race and borders. The idea of the Ummah was not abstract, it was alive in their hearts. The Hindus and Muslims had lived together for centuries, yes, but togetherness was not sameness. The two communities had different visions of life. Their heroes, their histories, their aspirations all diverged. The Hindus saw India as Bharat Mata, the divine motherland. For Muslims, sovereignty belonged to Allah alone. Where one community's nationalism was tied to land and culture, the other's was tied to faith and morality. This difference was not hatred. It was reality. It was the natural distinction of two civilizations that had coexisted but never fused. And once the Muslims began to understand this, their demand for respect, for representation, and for recognition took on new meaning. Sir Said Ahmad Khan, the same man who had urged Muslims to embrace modern education, now began to emphasize this difference openly. He told his people that in a democratic system where the majority ruled, the Muslims could never expect justice from numbers alone. He famously said, "The Hindus and Muslims are two eyes of the same beautiful bride." But even he knew that both eyes had to see clearly for the vision to survive, and that clarity was not there. When the Indian National Congress began its rise, Sir Syed warned the Muslims not to be carried away by the illusion of unity. He said, "India is not a single nation. It is a continent of nations." His words would later echo through history. as the philosophical foundation for the two-nation theory. The identity of Muslims was no longer something they merely inherited. It was something they began to consciously defend. They started forming associations, schools, and political groups that reflected their own needs. The All India Muslim League, founded in 1906, became the political expression of what the Aligarh movement had started intellectually. It was the moment when thought turned into action. But even before the League, the sense of difference had already taken root. The Muslims were learning to speak with one voice, not against others, but for themselves. They began to celebrate their heroes, from Tipu Sultan to Aurangzeb, as symbols of courage and faith. Their poets began to remind them of their past glory and future promise. Their scholars began to write about the unity of Muslims across India, a unity of purpose, not just prayer. And then came the poetry of Allama Iqbal, a voice that would transform awareness into passion. Iqbal spoke not of divisions, but of destiny. He told Muslims to look within themselves, to rediscover the spiritual identity. His verses called them Shaheen, eagles, destined to soar above worldly boundaries. He reminded them that they were not born to serve others' thrones, but to build their own. Iqbal's message was clear: a nation without self-respect cannot survive. He said, "Apni dunya aap paida karaga zinda hai tu." Create your own world if you truly live. This was the call of identity, not borrowed, not imposed, but rediscovered. While the Congress continued to speak of one India, one nation, the Muslims began to realize that unity without equality is submission. They saw how Hindu leaders demanded democratic representation by majority rule, a rule that would always outnumber Muslims. They saw how their festivals, their language, their history were being pushed aside in favor of a singular Indian identity. Urdu, once the lingua franca of culture, was being replaced by Hindi. Even language was becoming a battlefield of belonging. And in those moments of conflict, identity sharpened like a blade. The Muslims began to say, "We are not against unity, but unity must respect difference. We are not against India, but India must accept that we are a separate nation within it." From Bengal to Punjab, from Delhi to Lucknow, the realization grew: Islam was not just a religion, it was a way of life that shaped politics, society, and art. The Muslims could not separate their faith from their identity because it was their identity. And once that truth settled into their hearts, there was no turning back. The young generation, educated and aware, carried this realization with them like a flame. It was not rebellion they sought. It was recognition. It was not isolation they wanted. It was equality. But equality was impossible without acknowledging difference. The Muslims had once been rulers. Now, they were learning to be a nation again. Their unity was not built on territory, but on faith. Their vision was not borrowed from Europe's nationalism, but rooted in their own belief that a nation lives not by blood or race, but by values and faith. This was the birth of consciousness, the formation of identity. It was when a scattered people began to see themselves as one ummah, one purpose, one voice, standing not merely in the shadow of their past, but on the threshold of a new dawn. Every movement, every awakening, no matter how powerful, needs a voice, a leader who can turn emotion into direction, thought into action, and belief into destiny. The Muslims of India had found their identity, they had rediscovered their pride, but they still lacked one thing: unity under a leader who could carry their hopes to victory. History was waiting for that one figure who would not only speak for a nation, but embody its struggle, its pain, and its purpose. And in that defining moment of history, a man stepped forward whose name would forever be written in golden letters: Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He was not born into the chaos of rebellion. He was not raised among slogans and protests. He was calm, disciplined, precise, a man of reason, not rage. In a time when emotions often clouded judgment, Jinnah's strength was his clarity. His mind was sharper than any sword, his principles stronger than any army. He believed that freedom could not be shouted into existence. It had to be earned with dignity, logic, and unwavering determination. Before he became the Quaid-e-Azam, Jinnah was already a brilliant lawyer in Bombay. He stood in the courts with a quiet confidence, armed with facts, law, and eloquence that made even the British judges listen. He was admired for his intellect, respected for his honesty, and known for his discipline. But what few realized was that beneath this calm exterior, there was a storm, a passion for justice, for fairness, and for the rights of his people. In his early political career, Jinnah joined the Indian National Congress. He believed in unity, in cooperation, in the dream that Hindus and Muslims could stand together against British imperialism. He was a firm believer in constitutional methods and peaceful struggle. To him, independence could not be built on hatred. It had to be built on mutual respect. He often said that we must have our freedom, but we must have it with honor. For years, Jinnah was called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. He worked tirelessly to bridge the growing divide between the two communities. He spoke at meetings, he negotiated tirelessly, and he defended the idea that all Indians, regardless of religion, deserved equal rights under one flag. His belief in dialogue was unshakable. But as time passed, Jinnah began to see what Sir Imran Khan had foreseen decades earlier, that equality in a land ruled by majority politics was an illusion. The Congress, dominated by Hindu leadership, spoke of unity but practiced dominance. Decisions were made without Muslim consultation. Promises of fairness faded behind the walls of numbers. And Jinnah, the constitutionalist, began to realize that words like democracy and national unity meant one thing for the majority and another for the Muslims. The breaking point came slowly but clearly. The Lucknow Pact of 1916 was one of Jinnah's greatest efforts to bring both communities together. It established separate electorates, giving Muslims the right to elect their own representatives. For a brief moment, it seemed like a victory for cooperation, a balance between unity and distinction. But that balance was short-lived. After the death of leaders like Gokhale and Tilak, the Congress began to change its tune. The rise of Hindu revivalist movements, such as the Shudi and Sangathan campaigns, sought to reclaim India as a purely Hindu civilization. The language of politics began to turn into the language of religion. The Muslims were no longer seen as partners in freedom, but as outsiders. And Jinnah, who had once believed in shared destiny, saw the truth unfolding before him. The Hindu majority leadership was not willing to recognize Muslims as a separate political entity. Their idea of freedom was independence for one nation, not for two. Jinnah withdrew from the Congress, disappointed but not defeated. His silence during those years was not surrender, it was reflection. He left India for London disillusioned by politics, but his departure was only temporary, because when destiny calls a leader, there is no escape. The Muslims of India, meanwhile, were falling into disarray. The Khilafat movement had collapsed. The Hindu-Muslim unity had shattered, and confusion reigned once again. The Muslims needed a voice, someone who could rise above emotion and guide them with clarity and purpose. And so the call reached Jinnah once more. When he returned to India in the early 1930s, he was not the same man who had left. The world had changed, and so had he. The fire that once burned quietly within him was now a blazing resolve. He had seen through the illusions of unity. He knew now that the Muslims could not survive as a powerless minority under a Hindu-dominated system. He understood that their faith, culture, and politics demanded a homeland of their own. And thus began a new chapter, the rise of Muhammad Ali Jinnah as the leader of the Muslim nation. When he took the stage at Muslim League sessions, the crowd saw a man who spoke few words, but carried mountains of meaning. He was not a man of passion, he was a man of principle. His speeches were not fiery, but they were fearless. He spoke with conviction that cut through doubt like light through fog. Under his leadership, the Muslim League transformed from a quiet organization into a mass movement. He gave Muslims a sense of purpose, a clear goal, and a voice that could not be ignored. He traveled across India, from Karachi to Calcutta, from Lahore to Lucknow, reminding Muslims that they were not weak, that their history was not over, that their future was still theirs to shape. He told them, "You are a nation with your own culture and civilization, your own language and literature, your own art and architecture, your own laws and moral codes." Every word echoed with truth. Every phrase rekindled pride. The British called him stubborn. His opponents called him arrogant. But his people called him Quaid-e-Azam, the great leader, because they knew that behind his calm face was an unbreakable will. He refused to bow. He refused to compromise on principle, and he refused to let the Muslims be reduced to a powerless minority. He was not loud, but his silence carried authority. He was not poetic, but his words became history. He did not command with emotion, but he led with vision. He believed that the Muslims of India needed not pity, but power, not sympathy, but sovereignty. By the late 1930s, Jinnah's leadership had become the guiding star of Muslim politics. The 1937 provincial elections showed clearly what he had long feared. The Congress rule in Hindu majority provinces was oppressive to Muslims. It tried to impose cultural and political dominance under the name of nationalism. The Muslims were insulted, their rights ignored, their voices dismissed. And when Jinnah saw this reality, he turned to his people and asked the question that changed history. Do you wish to live as slaves in your own land, or do you wish to live as free men under your own flag? The response was thunderous. From every corner of India, the answer came, freedom. And thus, Jinnah began to transform that cry into a movement, disciplined, organized, and unstoppable. He united rich and poor, men, women, young and old, under one vision: the creation of a homeland where Muslims could live by their faith, free from fear, free from domination. He was not just a politician, he was a symbol of resilience. At every step, he faced opposition from the British, hostility from the Congress, and skepticism even from within his own ranks. But he stood alone, dignified and unwavering, his faith in his cause stronger than any obstacle. When others gave up, he moved forward. When others doubted, he believed. When the world said it was impossible, he said, "We shall see." And in that resolve, in that unbending determination, a nation began to see itself through his eyes, not as victims of history, but as creators of destiny. From lawyer to leader, from ambassador of unity to father of a nation, Muhammad Ali Jinnah had become the voice the Muslims were waiting for. The voice that would soon echo across continents, carrying with it the message of freedom, dignity, and faith. Every great movement begins with a dream. Not the kind of dream that fades with sleep, but the kind that wakes nations, the kind that turns silence into song, despair into direction. For the Muslims of India, that dream came through the pen and the voice of one man whose words could pierce the soul, whose thoughts could lift a nation from darkness. Allama Muhammad Ali Iqbal. He was not a politician, he was not a general, he was a thinker, a poet, a philosopher. And yet, his impact on the political destiny of millions would be greater than that of any ruler. Iqbal's message was not born in offices or assemblies. It came from the deepest wells of spiritual truth, from his understanding of what makes a nation truly alive. He looked at the Muslims of India, a people broken by centuries of decline, and he saw in them not weakness, but potential. He saw an ummah that had forgotten its power, and he sought to remind them of who they truly were. Iqbal's journey began long before he spoke of Pakistan. As a young man, he absorbed the knowledge of both East and West. He studied philosophy in Europe, where he saw the modern world, its progress, its freedom, its science. But he also saw its emptiness. He saw a world that had lost its soul, where materialism had replaced faith. He returned home not as an imitator of the West, but as a reformer who wanted to blend modern intellect with Islamic spirit. He believed that Muslims did not need to abandon their faith to progress. They needed to rediscover its essence. For him, Islam was not just a religion of rituals, it was a complete way of life, a source of energy, and the foundation of human dignity. Iqbal looked around and saw his people divided, discouraged, and disconnected from their faith. He saw them trapped between two worlds, the colonial system that sought to control them, and the Hindu majority politics that sought to absorb them. But Iqbal refused to see Muslims as victims. He saw them as heirs of a mighty civilization, a civilization that had once led the world in knowledge, justice, and spiritual insight. Through his poetry, he began to speak directly to their hearts. His verses were not mere words, they were awakenings. He spoke of Kudi, the self, that inner strength and awareness that gives life its purpose. He told Muslims that they had forgotten their Kudi, their self-respect, their divine spark. He said, Kudi ko kar bilenditna, ki harta dia sipil, kuda ban sikad puchi, beta teri razak ya hai. Raise yourself so high that before every destiny, God Himself will ask what you desire. Those words were not just poetry. They were a revolution of thought. Iqbal's message was clear: freedom does not begin with borders, it begins with the mind. A nation cannot rise until its people believe in their own worth. He called upon the youth, the Shahin, the eagle, to rise above fear and comfort, to soar beyond limitations. He said that Muslims must not beg for power. They must earn it by becoming strong in faith, character, and intellect. In every line he wrote, there was fire, a fire that burned away despair and replaced it with purpose. When he said, Siteran, si age jahan, aura baihain, he wasn't just speaking of stars. He was telling a generation that their limits were illusions, that there were worlds beyond the ones they could see. But Iqbal was not just a dreamer. He was a visionary who could see the direction history was taking. He understood the political reality of India better than most politicians of his time. He saw that the Congress's idea of a single Indian nation would lead to Muslim subjugation under Hindu dominance. He believed that a community that lived by a unique faith, culture, and law needed its own homeland to live freely according to its beliefs. And so in 1930, in Allahabad, at the annual session of the All India Muslim League, Allama Iqbal gave a speech that would change history. In his calm, thoughtful voice, he declared a vision that the Muslims of India should have a separate homeland in the northwest, where they could live as a free nation guided by the principles of Islam. His words were simple but profound. I would like to see the Punjab North, West Frontier Province, Sindh, and Baluchistan amalgamated into a single state, self-government within the British Empire or without it. The formation of a consolidated Muslim state appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims. For the first time, the idea of Pakistan, though not yet named, had been spoken aloud. It was not a slogan, it was a philosophy. Iqbal was not asking for separation out of hate, but out of hope. He knew that Muslims and Hindus could live side by side as neighbors, but not as one political nation. Their spiritual and cultural differences were too deep, their visions of life too distinct. Iqbal's dream was not about division. It was about preservation. It was about giving Muslims the space to live freely as Muslims, to build a society based on justice, equality, and moral strength. Soon after his Allahabad address, Iqbal continued to guide Muslim thought through his poetry and letters. He wrote to leaders, he advised scholars, and he became the philosophical compass of the Muslim League. Even Jinnah, who had once stepped away from politics, found in Iqbal's vision a renewed purpose. Their correspondence reveals a deep connection. Jinnah, the man of law and logic, and Iqbal, the poet of spirit and soul. Together, their ideas would lay the foundation for a nation yet unborn. Iqbal reminded Jinnah that politics without faith was hollow, and Jinnah reminded Iqbal that faith needed structure and law to flourish. The poet dreamed, the leader acted, and together they became the architects of freedom. Iqbal's poetry became the anthem of awakening. In the streets of Lahore, in the classrooms of Aligarh, in the hearts of youth from Bengal to Peshawar, his verses were recited like prayers. His call was not to rebellion, but to realization. He told Muslims that their chains were not made of iron, but of ignorance and fear, and that breaking them required courage of the soul. When he wrote, "Utho meri dunya ki gariban ko jagadu," rise, awaken the poor of my world, it was not just poetry, it was a cry for justice. He believed that Islam's message was universal, that it uplifted not just one nation, but all of humanity. And yet, Iqbal's vision was deeply rooted in spiritual realism. He knew that faith without action was weakness, and action without faith was chaos. His dream was to combine both. A society that was free in spirit and just in structure. He told Muslims that freedom was not the gift of rulers, it was the birthright of believers. He urged them to trust in Allah, to rise in unity, and to create a homeland where their faith would guide their future. When Iqbal passed away in 1938, many thought his dream might fade. But dreams like his do not die. They travel through time, carried by those who believe. His vision had already taken root in the hearts of millions. It had reached the mind of Jinnah, who would soon turn that dream into reality. Iqbal's poetry continued to whisper to the hearts of Muslims. Tu Shaheen hai, Parwaz hai kam tera. You are an eagle, your flight is your destiny. He had reminded a lost people of their wings. He had given the Muslim nation not just a destination, but a reason to believe that they could soar once more. Beyond fear, beyond oppression, toward a horizon of freedom and faith. There are moments in history when a single voice changes the course of nations. Moments when words rise above politics and echo through time as prophecy. One such moment came in 1930 in the historic city of Allahabad. The air was thick with uncertainty. The land was restless under the weight of colonial rule, And the hearts of millions of Muslims beat with the silent question, what will become of us? It was then at the annual session of the All India Muslim League that Allama Muhammad Iqbal stood before a crowd of delegates, scholars, and leaders and delivered a speech that would alter the destiny of the subcontinent. It would later be remembered not merely as a political proposal, but as the spiritual blueprint of a new nation, the speech that sowed the first seed of what would one day be Pakistan. The sun was setting over the banks of the Yamuna when Iqbal rose to speak. His presence was calm, yet commanding. He did not shout, he did not demand. He simply spoke, as a teacher would to his students, with clarity and conviction. But every word he uttered carried the weight of centuries. The story of a people once mighty, now searching for identity in a land where their future seemed uncertain. He began not with politics, but with philosophy. He spoke about Islam, not as a religion confined to prayer and worship, but as a complete system of life, a source of moral and political strength. He reminded Muslims that they were not just a religious group among many. They were a nation with their own culture, civilization, and moral law. And in that reminder, he planted the seed of awakening. Iqbal's central message was bold yet simple. The Muslims of India could not survive as a minority in a democratic system dominated by Hindus. The British might leave one day, but what would happen then? A so-called united India would not guarantee justice for Muslims. It would reduce them to a permanent underclass, a people ruled by another majority, this time in their own homeland. He declared that the Muslims of northwestern India, in Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, and the northwest frontier province, shared not only geography, but also faith, culture, and values. He envisioned these regions united as one autonomous state where Muslims could live according to their principles, where their faith would guide their laws, and where justice would not be a privilege, but a right. And then came the words that turned silence into electricity. I would like to see the Punjab, North, West Frontier Province, Sindh and Balochistan amalgamated into a single state. Self-government within the British Empire or without it. The formation of a consolidated North West Indian Muslim state appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims, at least of North West India. It was the first time anyone had said it aloud, that Muslims were not merely a community, but a nation deserving of political identity. Those sitting in the audience were stunned. Some looked at each other in disbelief. Others nodded slowly as the realization dawned upon them. This was not just another speech. This was revelation given form. Iqbal's address did more than outline a geographical division. It gave Muslims a philosophical foundation for their freedom. He argued that Islam provided a unique social order, one that could not coexist within a Hindu majority political framework. To merge the two, he said, would destroy both. His logic was unbreakable, his reasoning divine. But what made Iqbal's words so powerful was not just their political clarity, it was their spiritual depth. He spoke not from ambition, but from vision. He was not asking for separation out of hatred, but out of love, love for faith, for identity, and for the dignity of his people. He wanted Muslims to live in a land where they could worship freely, educate their children in their own values, and govern themselves without fear or oppression. He told them that Islam was not a relic of the past, but a living force capable of guiding modern life. He said that in Islam, there is no separation between religion and politics, no division between the soul and the state. The moral principles that shaped an individual must also shape a government. And that government, he believed, could only exist in a place where Muslims held power over their own destiny. Iqbal spoke of the decay of Muslim civilization, of how centuries of subjugation had dulled the sharpness of their faith. He reminded them of their glorious past, the days when Muslims led the world in knowledge, justice, and science, and then asked why they had fallen. His answer was simply, they had forgotten who they were. They had lost their unity, their khudi, their inner power. He called upon them to awaken, to reclaim their sense of purpose. His words were a call to rebirth, not of territory, but of spirit. The creation of a Muslim state, he said, was not merely a political necessity, it was a spiritual obligation. Only by living under the principles of Islam could Muslims regain their strength and fulfill their divine role as bearers of justice. But Iqbal's vision was not one of isolation. He did not imagine Muslims turning their backs on others. He envisioned harmony, a relationship of mutual respect between Muslims and Hindus, between faiths and cultures. But he knew that such harmony could only exist when both stood as equals, not when one ruled over the other. Separation, in his eyes, was not division, it was balance. His idea was radical for its time, yet deeply rational. He predicted that a single Indian federation under majority rule would collapse under its own contradictions. His foresight was prophetic. For just 17 years later, the subcontinent would be divided and Pakistan would emerge as the embodiment of his dream. But in 1930, few could see that far. Many dismissed Iqbal's vision as poetic idealism. Others feared it would divide the nationalist movement. Yet, those who truly understood the pulse of Muslim India felt something awaken within them. For the first time, they could imagine a homeland of their own, a place where their call to prayer would echo freely, where their faith would shape their destiny, and where no one would tell them what they could or could not be. And so, the 1930 Allahabad address became more than just a speech. It became a mirror that showed Muslims their true face. It gave their scattered thoughts a center, their silent fears a voice, and their dormant hopes a direction. Tim, after that speech, something changed in the air. The word nation began to carry new meaning. The youth who once spoke of freedom now spoke of faith. The scholars who once debated policies began to discuss purpose. The elders who had lost hope began to whisper of a future yet unseen. Iqbal had not just defined a dream, He had given it structure. He had laid the philosophical foundation upon which Jinnah would later build the political fortress of Pakistan. The poet had sketched the vision, and the leader would soon bring it to life. Every revolution begins in the heart before it reaches the street. And in 1930, at Allahabad, the revolution that would shape the destiny of millions began in the hearts of the Muslims who heard Iqbal speak. They might not have known it then, but they were witnessing the birth of an idea that would change maps, redefine nations, and resurrect a people. Allama Iqbal had spoken not only to his time, but to all time, to remind Muslims that they were not meant to live as subjects, but as sovereigns under the rule of God, that their history was not finished, but waiting to be written again, and that the land of their future already existed in their faith, waiting to take form through their unity and will. Every great movement begins with a question that burns deep inside a nation's soul. For the Muslims of the subcontinent, that question was simple yet profound. Who are we in this new world ruled by foreign masters? The British Raj had brought with it a strange silence, one that echoed through the streets of Delhi, the mosques of Lahore, and the fields of Bengal. The Mughal Empire had fallen, and with it, centuries of Muslim power and prestige had collapsed. The conquerors now sat where emperors once ruled, and the people who had once led the world in learning and culture now struggled to find their place in their own land. It was more than just political defeat. It was a crisis of identity. The Muslims were no longer rulers. They were subjects. The British brought with them new systems, new languages, new schools, and a new order that rewarded those who adapted and punished those who resisted. The Hindus, quicker to embrace English education, and the new bureaucracy began to rise within the colonial system. But the Muslims, tied to their traditions, wary of losing their faith and culture, held back, and in their hesitation, they fell behind. To the British, the Muslims were the children of their former enemies. They were the inheritors of the empire the British had conquered, the Mughals. And so, suspicion hung over them like a shadow. The British saw them as proud, defiant, and unwilling to bow. They excluded them from key posts, from education, from influence. The once powerful community now found itself lost between two forces: the colonial rulers who distrusted them, and the rising Hindu elite who sought to dominate the new political order. In this new India, the numbers became power. The British introduced representative institutions, councils, assemblies, elections. But in a land where Hindus outnumbered Muslims by 3-1, what chance did the Muslims have? The voice of one became the voice of none. And so began a new kind of struggle, not fought with swords or cannons, but with ideas, identity, and survival. The Muslims realized that they were not just losing political control. They were losing their cultural essence. Their language, Urdu, was being pushed aside in favor of Hindi. Their customs were mocked as outdated. Their faith was dismissed as superstition by the new secular intelligentsia. The history books rewritten by colonial scholars began to paint their glorious past as tyranny and darkness. The children of those who built the Taj Mahal were told that they had no place in modern India. And yet, in the midst of despair, the spirit of resilience began to flicker once more. The Muslims of India refused to vanish quietly. From Delhi to Aligarh, from Lucknow to Lahore, a new awareness began to grow, a realization that their survival depended not on blending in, but on standing tall as who they were. This struggle was not just about politics. It was about the soul of a nation. Could the Muslims preserve their faith, their culture, and their dignity in a system designed to erase their distinctiveness? Could they remain true to Islam in a land where every law, every policy, every symbol was shaped by foreign rulers and Hindu majorities? To understand this, we must step into the lives of the ordinary Muslims of that time. Imagine a scholar who once taught at a grand madrasa in Delhi, are now forced to close his doors because the British had banned Arabic and Persian as official languages. Imagine a noble family whose ancestors had ruled vast territories, now reduced to poverty and humiliation. Imagine a young student unsure whether to learn English and risk losing his faith, or to remain ignorant and lose his future. That was the dilemma of the Muslim nation under the Raj. A choice between survival and identity. And for many, it seemed that they could not have both. But history has always shown that when a nation faces its deepest crisis, leaders emerge from the ashes. One such man was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, a scholar, reformer, and visionary who refused to let his people be buried under the ruins of the past. After the War of Independence in 1857, when the British crushed the rebellion and executed thousands of Muslims, Sir Syed saw the truth that others could not. He realized that the Muslims could not fight the British through rebellion. They had to rise through knowledge. He urged Muslims to adapt, to learn English, to study science, to understand the modern world, not to abandon their faith, but to strengthen it through education. He founded the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College in Aligarh, which would later become Aligarh Muslim University. It was more than a school, it was the birthplace of a new Muslim consciousness. Through education, Sir Syed taught Muslims to think of themselves not as subjects, but as a community with a purpose. He reminded them that Islam encouraged learning. That knowledge was the weapon of the believer. His message was clear. The pen is mightier than the sword, and our revival will come not from rebellion, but from reform. His vision was revolutionary. He wanted Muslims to walk confidently into the modern age, to master the tools of progress without losing their soul. But not everyone agreed with him. Some called him a traitor, accusing him of being too close to the British. Others said he was abandoning Islamic tradition. But Sir Syed was unwavering. He saw beyond the noise. He saw the future. He also saw something else, the growing danger of Hindu dominance. As the British introduced local elections and political representation, Sir Syed realized that democracy in India would mean rule by majority, and the majority was Hindu. In such a system, he warned the Muslims would be trampled underfoot. He was the first to declare openly that Hindus and Muslims were two separate nations, different in religion, culture, law, and outlook. It was not hatred, it was realism. His words, once ignored, would later become the foundation of the two-nation theory. But while leaders like Sir Syed worked for reform, others kept the spiritual flame alive. Scholars in Deoband, poets like Hali and Shibli, and educators in Lahore and Lucknow all carried forward the message that Islam was not just a faith to be practiced in mosques, but a force to guide life. The Urdu language became the heartbeat of Muslim identity. It was through Urdu newspapers, books, and poetry that the Muslims began to find their voice again. And slowly, that voice began to grow louder. The Muslims began to organize to demand recognition as a distinct political entity. The All India Muslim League was formed in 1906, a turning point that gave political shape to the spiritual awakening that had been begun decades earlier. The Muslims of India, once silent, were now learning to speak again. They were learning to stand together, to think of themselves not as scattered communities, but as one nation, united by faith, driven by purpose, and destined for freedom. Under the British Raj, the Muslims had learned one of the hardest lessons in history. That freedom is not given, it is reclaimed through faith, knowledge, and unity. The British might have taken their thrones, but they could not take their belief. They could not erase the centuries of culture, the poetry of Iqbal, the vision of society, the legacy of their ancestors. That belief, that unshakable conviction in their identity, became the light that guided them through the darkest times. It told them that though they had fallen, they were not defeated. Though they were ruled, they were not broken. And though they were outnumbered, they were not alone. It was this struggle, quiet yet profound, that gave birth to a new consciousness, a new unity, and a new demand. The Muslims of India were no longer asking to be remembered. They were preparing to be reborn. There are moments in history when words become more powerful than weapons, when a speech becomes a sword, and a resolution becomes a revolution. One such moment came in March 1940 in the city of Lahore. The air was thick with tension, the world was at war, and India was caught between empires, one foreign, the other rising within. But in that uncertain hour, a nation found its voice. And on the sacred ground of Minto Park, now known as Iqbal Park, the Muslims of India declared to the world that we're not a minority begging for rights, but a nation demanding destiny. The Lahore Resolution, passed on the 23rd of March 1940, was not just a political document. It was the thunderclap that awakened the sleeping soul of a people. It was the moment when the dream of Allama Iqbal took shape under the leadership of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Quaid-e-Azam. It was the moment when the Muslims of India finally said, enough. Enough of being told they were too few. Enough of being called a community within another's nation.